Welcome to Micro Lecture 5.2 in the Legal and Governance Aspects series. We will discuss stakeholder management in this one. We will first discuss the concept of stakeholder management and then turn to the more important question of selection of stakeholders to take in taking care of their interests and demands. So in the end, you will not be able to satisfy all stakeholders' demands, so there will be some selection involved. There's a paper connected to this micro lecture by Hollander. Now, if we look for a general idea of what we mean by stakeholder management or stakeholdering, it is taking the interests and the needs or the demands of stakeholders into account. Of course, that's still a very general definition, and it begs the question of who we consider as stakeholders. When is some kind of actor to be considered as a stakeholder? Now, if you translate the concept literally, it is someone who holds a stake, someone who has a stake in the project that we are talking about. And having a stake might that you have something to gain when the project is realized in practice, or you might have something to lose. You might be negatively affected by the construction of a certain building or the activities that are made in the building process, but also in what is done in the building after it has been finished. Now, in terms of the definition, there is basically two ways of looking at it. The first one is, of course, looking at the stakes. So only those actors that really have a stake are to be considered as a stakeholder. Another way of looking at it is to have a more broad definition in terms of the actors that might have an influence on the project, on the process. So there might be some actors out there that do not have a stake themselves, but they might influence the process. For instance, a typical example is media. Media, if discussion gets involved in terms of a certain project, media might have a role in that. They might not have a stake themselves, but they might play an important role in the public discussion that is surrounding a certain project. So they might be influential without having a stake themselves. And of course, people have different ideas of whether to consider those as stakeholders or not. If we think of typical examples of stakeholders, of course there are those that are related directly to the company or the organization you are looking for. So for instance, shareholders of the company, the people that work there, the employees, and of course the people that you work for, the clients. In general, in the surrounding of the project and the company, there will be different actors that might have a stake. Governmental actors, or more in general, public actors. They might not be governments, but they might still have public tasks. They might be seen as having a stake. Professional organizations might have a role in the process. And of course, building is a local activity. It is connected to a certain area. So if you are building on a certain spot, the residents in the surrounding of the spot, they might face consequences of the work that you do. There might be interest organizations involved. And if the building is on a very large project, for instance in infrastructure, then even the general public might be seen as a relevant stakeholder. What you can see is that there is a choice in terms of how broad you define the idea of stakeholders. If it's more narrow, then fewer actors are involved, are seen as stakeholders. If it's more broad, then more of them are taken into account and have to be considered when doing your stakeholder management. Now, once we know and have identified who the stakeholders are, we still have the choice in terms of who to include in the stakeholder management process. Which demands do we take into account? The reason why there is a choice here is that inclusion brings different costs. In the first place, it brings transaction costs. If many different stakeholders are involved in the process, of course you have to find out what their demands are. You have to perhaps negotiate with what they want. It might be the case that different stakeholders have different demands and conflicting demands, so you have to find a way of meeting the different demands together, or perhaps disregarding certain demands. So there's a lot of process costs involved in this. It also might be the case that the demands that the stakeholders have on the project result in additional production costs. It might be that the design of the building that has to be built has to change, and different measures have to be taken in order to meet the different demands, and they result in many cases in additional production costs. So in terms of further selection, there are basically two approaches or perspectives. The first one is what we call the selective approach, and the idea is here to focus on those stakeholders that form a risk for the project. So risks in terms of additional costs, in terms of transaction, but also certainly in terms of production costs. And the basic idea here is that you focus on those that form a high risk, and those that do not contain risks or very low levels of risk, you might perhaps not involve them in the stakeholder management. The other focus is what we label the inclusive approach, and the basic idea here is to focus on all that can really contribute to the project. So it's not only about risk, but stakeholders might also have positive contributions to the project. Sure, they might be negative as well, but all those contributions have to be taken into account. And the basic idea of this more inclusive approach, and that's why we call it that way, is that usually you will include many more stakeholders in the process and try to gain. Of course, this involves additional transaction costs, but maybe it might also result in benefits and more value in terms of how you construct the building. So in that sense, it's more also aiming at positive results. The paper by Hollander that we are discussing is part of the selective approach. It's important to understand that. So it's the focus on those stakeholders that might provide a high risk for the project. What then makes stakeholders have a high risk? First factor that is important here is that they might have a lot of impact if they get active, if they get involved in the process. And there are basically two kind of things to look for, and that makes stakeholders have a lot of impact. The first one is that they have power. Different power resources might be available to them. The first one is, of course, political power. They might be in a situation where they can take crucial decisions. For instance, local governmental organizations or other public organizations. They might take important decisions that have an impact on your project. It also might be the case that the stakeholders have critical resources that you need in order to finalize the project. Of course, if you own land, if they own land, that's important, and they can have a say in the project. They might have the money that you need in order to finalize the project. They might also hold the expertise, local expertise that you need in order to finish the project. So having power is the first reason of why they might have a lot of impact. The second reason is that they might have legitimate claims that cannot be ignored in the project, not morally ignored. If you look for an example, it might be that residents in the area surrounding the project, they might not have specific powerful resources, but if the project has a large impact on them, a negative impact, these claims that they have on the project might be seen as legitimate by other actors, for instance, local governmental actors. So if the claims are seen as legitimate by others, the people with those claims might be able to mobilize other stakeholders that do have a lot of power. And by that they become important and they might have a large impact on the project. Now, taking these two aspects together defines the level of impact that a stakeholder might have. And of course, having a high level of impact is making you important enough to get taken notice in stakeholder management. Now, the level of impact is one thing to look for, but another one is the question of how likely it is that stakeholders will get active in the process. Not every stakeholder will take the trouble of getting active in the process. So this is about the probability of impact that they have. And the one thing to look for in terms of how likely it is that stakeholders will get active is the impact that the project has on them. It's not on their impact on the project, but the impact of the project on them. So the level of consequences that the project has for them. That is a very important factor in determining whether stakeholders get active or not, and so that is relevant for the probability of impact. The basic idea of the approach is that you combine the level of impact and the probability of impact into a strategy regarding these stakeholders and to which extent you really focus on their demands and their needs. Now, obviously, those that have a high level of impact and a high probability of impact, those are the key players. You know they will get active, and you know that they are very influential because, for instance, they have a lot of power. You will really take them seriously in terms of the process and in terms of meeting their demands. On the other level of the scale, of course, you will find those where the level of impact is low and the probability of impact is low. They're not very likely to get active, and if they would get active, their influence would not be very important. So you will pay minimal effort to them in order to prevent, for instance, transaction costs. Of course, there are also those where the probability of impact is low, but if they would get active, their level of impact would be very high. The basic idea here is to keep them satisfied. Make sure that they will be satisfied with what you do. They will most likely remain inactive, and they are not posing a large threat to the process and to the project. Then there is the fourth category, and that is those where the probability of impact is high, so it's very likely that they will get involved in the process, but their impact will be low. So it's good to keep them informed of what is going on, but you don't have to be too seriously in terms of taking their demands into account, because the risk that they pose to the project is not that very high because their level of impact is low. A third aspect to take into consideration is the direction of impact. Of course, if you are looking at stakeholder management from the perspective of risk management and avoidance of risk, then you are particularly focused on those stakeholders that might oppose the project, so that have active or passive opposition to the project. Now, of course, this is not always the case. Some stakeholders might actually support the project. They might get benefits from the project. So they might be either passive or actively supporting the project. And of course, you don't really mind them becoming active in the process, at least in terms of getting the results. It might be the case that if more stakeholders get involved in the process, it brings some transaction costs. But if this will help you in finalizing the result, they are beneficial, specifically in situations where there is also opposition. So if there are both opposition and supportive stakeholders, you might want the supportive stakeholders really to become active, and you might involve them to a large extent in the stakeholder management. If we summarize this oleander perspective, it's important to understand that you pay specific attention to those stakeholders that are likely to have a high impact. So it's level of impact multiplied by the probability of impact. And specifically in situations where the stakeholders oppose the project, the risk is of a loss of control over the project. And that loss of control is very likely, and that's something you want to avoid. It's about risk management as a strategy for stakeholding. It's important to understand that this starts from a specific idea of power. It's the idea that power is a relational concept. It's about the thing that you have power over someone. If you have power, you can tell someone else what to do. So you can make someone do something that the other one doesn't want to do by himself, but because you are powerful, you are able to command this person or this stakeholder. It's important to understand that this is only one concept of power. There is also another one, which we will discuss in the next slide. This other conceptualization of power is not seeing it as a relational concept, as something power over someone else, but as a capacity to act. And this is indicated by the idea that it is power to do something and power to create something together. So this is symbolized in the picture of the human tower, where the only reason why this can be built, why these people are able to do this, is because they combine their capacity to act. So the power is really the result of sharing this resource of power together, and that is why this is much more a positive idea of power. Power of someone else over you is not something to be prevented, but if you enable someone to help you, this is a good idea. And this is why it is framed as empowerment. So giving more power to someone else is beneficial because he or she might help you in realizing certain results. So in terms of stakeholder management, of course, the idea here is that it is not a risk that stakeholders become active, but it is really positive. The more powerful stakeholders contribute to your capacity to act, the more you will be able to produce certain results. And of course, this is related to basic ideas in terms of network creation. It's about long-term relations that you build. It's about trust that you build. Even though certain actors might not seem very powerful in terms of the previous conception, in terms of being a risk to the project, you might still involve them because they might have good ideas and they might help you in the end. If you commit them to the project, they might help you in solving your problems in a cooperative and maybe even in a creative way. So this really digs into this idea of stakeholder management as the creation of a network rather than as risk management and avoiding risk in the project. Now, if we look into some research that has been done on stakeholder management, we see that it is used quite often in specific projects, so on specific building projects, and it's also rather successful in increasing cooperation in those projects. However, we do not see it being used very much in terms of creating long-term relations, in terms of real network development, in terms of durable relations. There are some factors that play a role here. The first one is, of course, that stakeholder management, particularly if it's geared towards empowerment and durable relations, it takes a lot of investments in terms of the process that you take all these stakeholders into account. And of course the benefits are in terms of future cooperation of these stakeholders, and this is uncertain because it's in the future. It also really depends on the culture that the different stakeholders, and particularly also the people working in the construction sector, have. They are not very used to doing this, so it departs from their usual way of working. And of course there is a structural factor at work also, which is that the construction sector as such is more market oriented. And of course we know from our general discussion of the governance modes that in market coordination it's not very likely that you invest a lot in terms of durable relations, because then you move to the other form of coordination, which is network coordination, network governance. So there are particular reasons why in the current situations not many stakeholders and not many businesses in the construction sector are used to doing stakeholder management in terms of really developing long-term relations. It's time to wrap things up again. We discussed stakeholder management, what it means. We discussed the issue of selection of stakeholders in taking care of their interests and demands. We discussed the selective and the inclusive approach, and we also found out that The most prominent approach in the construction sector is the selective one that is aiming at risk avoidance, and that has a lot to do with the market conditions under which usually different companies are working in the construction sector.